Welcome to the Afghanistan Project Podcast. I am your host, Beth Bailey, and I'm really thrilled today to introduce you to our guest, Heather Barr. If you've been reading about the difficulties facing Afghan women in the aftermath of the Taliban's takeover, then you're likely already familiar with Heather's tremendous advocacy work as the Associate Director of the Women's Rights Division at Human Rights Watch. If you haven't run into Heather's work yet, then stay tuned because you are in for a crash course on the problems facing Afghan women and why those problems impact all of Afghanistan and the West. Just for a bit about Heather's background, prior to her 12-year career at Human Rights Watch, she worked with the UN Office on Drugs and Crime and the UN Development Program. Also, during and after receiving her JD from Columbia Law School, Heather worked to support prisoners who battled mental health disorders so that they could achieve justice through the Mental Health Project and as the director and founder of the Nathaniel Project. Heather, it's so great to have you here. Thanks for taking the time to join us and talk about this really important issue.
Thanks so much for inviting me, and thanks for caring about this issue so much.
I know that everybody who listens really does. This is the key thing. I think that the Taliban takeover has harmed so many Afghan women. So I want to, before we get started, I'd like to plug, you did a podcast recently with Ro Jacoby. It's a really great episode. It's about an hour long, and you guys talk about your long history in Afghanistan and I loved your story about 9/11 and being there at 9/11 and all these things. You've been tied to the country in a way for some time, and you talked about the paths toward holding the Taliban accountable for their crimes against Afghan women. And I'd urge everyone to give that episode a listen before or after you hear this. If you need to, pause right now and go listen. But the things you guys discussed are vital. And I'm going to try to veer away from rehashing those conversations because you can listen to them on that podcast. But what I really want to focus on is something that we at the podcast haven't been able to cover in depth yet. And that's the effect on women that the Taliban takeover has had, their utter loss of human rights. And just to start, because you were involved with the UN and you mentioned in Ro's podcast that you had some involvement in programs that were meant to help women in Afghanistan. I'd love to hear more about what those programs were and what kind of, what was the intent with the programming and what was the success or lack thereof in those programs while you were there.
Thanks. Thanks for inviting me. So I went to Afghanistan first in 2007 to work, as you said, for the United Nations Development Program. I was a deputy to an Afghan woman who was an assistant country director, and our portfolio included human rights and democracy, and also, including elections, which was, of course, a fascinating thing to work on. I mean, and then after 2 years in that role, I moved over to the UN Office on Drugs and Crime, where initially my job was to work on anti-corruption, and then my boss quit, and I ended up managing a broader portfolio that included justice reform and legislative drafting and so on. But I have a lot of thoughts about the work that the international community did in Afghanistan. And of course, it's all in dust and ruins now, but it wasn't in great shape before. The last time I went back to Afghanistan was in April 2021 to write a report about how women's access to healthcare was crashing because the international community, had built a system that was dependent on international aid and then was withdrawing that aid. When I worked on anti-corruption, I saw that the international community had really contributed in very significant ways to the level of corruption in Afghanistan. I saw, again and again and again how, supposed big government plans for, how the government was going to reform the justice sector or reform multiple different sectors across the whole government were written by foreign staff members or foreign consultants rather than the ministries themselves, and never necessarily had very much buy-in from those ministries. So I think that, the sort of level of competence and skill and sort of genuine understanding of how, you can help people do things, but they need to lead themselves was often missing in Afghanistan. And when we saw a lot of the usual stuff with, big for-profit contractors making huge amounts of money off of contracts to deliver various supposed capacity building in Afghanistan, that money coming into the country and going straight back out again. And so, I get frustrated when people sort of say, well, oh, everything was so terrible before, so that, suggesting that the Taliban takeover didn't make a difference, because that's absolutely not true, and particularly not for women. But let's also not romanticize what Afghanistan was like on August 14th, 2021, in many cases as a case study for what not to do in sort of state building and capacity building and international aid and so on. I think it was a disaster, and that's not even touching the issue of the military strategy, which I don't feel very qualified to comment on, not being a military expert by any stretch of the imagination. But people often sort of joked in a very grim way about how Afghanistan was a 20-year war that had 20 different military strategies, and I don't know if that's true or not, but we all know how it ended.
Yes, and it was a really tragic thing. I had not heard about the women's health on the decline, but that makes perfect sense. We had gotten the birth rate down, and we had worked so hard to help women in that regard, and it's very disheartening to hear that that was already underway before the Taliban came in and really decimated access even further to healthcare.
We also saw, so we did, Human Rights Watch, we did a report in 2018 about girls' education. And one of the things that we found then in 2018 is that attendance rates for girls were already falling in many provinces. And that was because of insecurity. It was because, the schools didn't really exist. There weren't enough schools available for the students. The government wasn't being very serious about trying to promote gender equality in the education sector. So, there were a lot of problems, and we as foreigners deserve a lot of the blame for those problems. I don't want to sort of make it sound like Afghans have no agency, and certainly plenty of Afghans, including ones in the former government, lined their pockets very thoroughly, but are sort of patting ourselves on the back for all the good that we did is pretty misguided. And and also some of these stories that I feel like people are telling themselves, particularly in Washington, about how everything's the fault of the Afghans and we don't owe them anything because they didn't fight for their country or whatever. That's incredibly untrue and dishonest and harmful to say that, when we know how extraordinarily high the casualty rates were for members of the Afghan National Army.
Absolutely. We've had some of them on the show, and to hear their, efforts up until the final moments, being in Helmand the day before they took Lashkar Gah, I believe, or something, it's galling to see. And you're right, we need to look at our own, because this is not only is this a crisis that's ongoing, but this is a time to learn that lesson of intervention and state building. Is that something we should engage in the future, or how can we help a country in a way that is sustainable, that actually makes an impact, where we don't, like a rubber band, snap back to women not being able to get healthcare and all of those things that we put so much blood and treasure into, just retreating.
On the topic of learning lessons, I'd love to say a word or two about the Afghan War Commission, if I could.
Please.
This, of course, is a body that's been set up, by the U.S. Government to try to learn those lessons. And I think we've seen in some other countries that they also have done these kinds of lessons learned exercises. And in some other countries, I think, I give them some credit for having been pretty tough with themselves and pretty honest. We've expressed concern, though, about the U.S. Afghan War Commission. It doesn't include any women's rights experts. It doesn't include any human rights experts. It seems to be very narrowly focused on military strategy and really not taking on any of these kind of broader concerns about what types of, ways in which the U.S. government used human rights and women's rights as a propaganda tool to garner support for the war, made, 2 decades worth of promises. We will always stand by you. We will never leave you alone. That's Hillary Clinton as Secretary of State, but many other U.S. officials made similar statements, and then just walked away, and left this complete disaster behind them, and don't seem to, and what we get after that is Joe Biden saying, I want to talk about happy things, I don't know if you remember that
I
press
do.
conference. Yes, just before the
Hmm.
4th of July. Yeah.
And I think that's the thing, that this is why the podcast exists, is because there are so many people who put all of themselves into trying to make this better. There were people who were working just to get a paycheck, sure, but a lot of people who worked in Afghanistan really developed a heart for the people of Afghanistan, for the country itself. And they're all impacted by these callous remarks that have been made, and not just the Biden's remark, but Kirby talking about the chaos. I didn't see any chaos at HKIA, and how not? These there are so many people who are impacted by what happened, and I would just love to see honesty and some self-reflection, and then doing something for Afghan women, which is why I would love to flash forward to the withdrawal. We almost always are talking with everyone who comes on about, what was your experience of the withdrawal? And I'd love to ask you, the Taliban said when they took over that they were going to honor women's rights within the norms of Islamic law. What were your thoughts when you heard them make that promise?
I've always had the great privilege of hearing what Afghan women think about Taliban promises. And so, turned out that they were completely right. When the Taliban were making similar promises in Doha, and they were saying that, women would be able to work, girls would be able to study, Afghan women were saying that's nonsense. There's no way that they'll do that. There is no Taliban 2.0, there's just Taliban is Taliban. And then when they held that press conference, I think it was on August 17th, 2 days after they'd taken over, and they said the same things again. And Afghan women said, no, don't believe it for a second. And I think it was about a day and a half later that they started their crackdown on women. I think the first thing that they did was fire women from the national television station. And it's gone on from there, So, and it's interesting to kind of tie that to the discussions that we keep having about Security Council Resolution 1325, which is about how women have the right to be full participants in all discussions about their country's future, including peace negotiations. If Afghan women had been full participants in the discussions that happened in Doha, I'm telling you that it wouldn't have been as easy for everyone to pretend to believe that the Taliban's false promises, and we're still seeing governments and the UN itself repeating that mistake of shutting Afghan women out of these really critical decisions. I think back in Doha, it was really convenient for U.S. diplomats to pretend to believe the Taliban. I think even they couldn't really have believed these promises. The Taliban suddenly, believing in gender equality, but it was very, very convenient for the Taliban to make those promises and for U.S. diplomats to pretend to believe them because they were leaving no matter what, and this gave them a bit of a fig leaf to do so.
Sure. And at the meantime, we've got all these reports. I remember in the earliest days, there were reports of the Taliban going through towns. And as they did, they would go and take all of the unmarried women, whether they were widows or just young girls of above marrying age, which I debate that age assertion, but that they were taking them as wives, forced marriage, that they, all of these allegations, and the world just kind of turned a blind eye and said, no, that's not happening. And like you said, we have these orders. What were some of the other early orders that indicated that no, things are not all right here, and that promise has been broken, aside from firing women from national TV? When did we start to see that progression?
So within the first couple of weeks, women who were showing up to work at government jobs were told that they should stay home, and of course, they were told that in a way that made it sound like it was temporary, and of course, it wasn't temporary at all. I think it was about a month later that we saw the ban on secondary education for girls. Again, with this language making it sound like it was temporary. And it's just gone on from there. I mean, it's impossible to list all of the different things that have happened, but obviously some of the some of the particularly memorable ones are women being banned from higher education as well, women being banned from working for international NGOs, women being banned from working for the United Nations. And then you have, so these are sort of, big, huge fundamental ones: freedom of movement, women being banned from leaving the country without a mahram, women being banned from traveling more than 70 kilometers without a mahram with them, and women being required in some places to bring a mahram with them to healthcare appointments, which is not only a barrier to receiving healthcare, but a violation of women's confidentiality. What if you're going to get birth control or treatment for an STD or an abortion, those kinds of things. But and then there are some that, another one we should mention is the closure of beauty salons, which, might seem like not that big a deal, but it's nothing to do with getting your hair and nails done. It's 60,000 women were working in beauty salons, and all of those women lost their jobs. And there's one other reason that the beauty salons were important, which is that one of the first things that the Taliban did was systematically dismantle the entire system that had been very painfully put in place to deal with domestic violence and other forms of gender-based violence. So a system of shelters, a law, the 2009 law on elimination of violence against women, specialized prosecution units, specialized courts, all of that gone virtually overnight. And what does that have to do with beauty salons? Well, what it has to do with beauty salons is that beauty salons, until the Taliban closed them, were one of the very few spaces outside the home that was a woman-only space where women could get together, talk to friends, get advice, get help. And that was too much for the Taliban. And so they had to take that away too. And then, I could go on all day.
All these are so important. They're so important to address. And that, the domestic violence too, now that recent ruling, which I have yet to see the Taliban comment on it, but the people were talking about how rather than going to shelters, the Taliban were now taking women out of domestic abuse situations and putting them into prisons. And it's a question of which of these is better. And I don't really know, because Human Rights Watch did an excellent roundup on what's happening to women in prisons. And you guys revealed that there was torture going on in prisons. So you're leaving a domestic abuse situation for a torture situation. It breaks my heart that Afghan women have to live in these circumstances. And you brought up to secondary education, which I remember when the promises were being made. Oh, it's the day. We're going to bring them back. We're going to bring them back. And I'm just sitting there waiting. I'm thinking there's no way. And right at the last second, they pulled that rug, and it almost felt like it was this international red line, for lack of a better term, that comes to my head, where people were going to finally do something if the Taliban did not allow girls to go back to school, but nothing happened. Why do you think why do you think people were so worked up and then just stopped that intervention process? Or do you think that it was more of maybe a media, no one did anything. It was just another media story that died after 5 days, and there was no international real anything with teeth that made the Taliban change their behavior?
I think that moment when, as you say, I think it was in March of 2022, when the Taliban had said that schools were going to reopen on this specific day. It was the New Year in Afghanistan, and then that morning they said, no, actually, not happening. I think that was a turning point in a way. I think that up until that point, I think the Taliban had been trying to sort of figure out what relationship they were going to have with the international community. And I think that, perhaps they were genuinely considering reopening the schools. And there's been a lot made out of this idea that there's somehow pragmatic Taliban, an extremist Taliban, and that, people have a meeting with Sirajuddin Haqqani, and he says that he thinks that the girls' schools should be reopened. And so then they go away feeling really special because Sirajuddin Haqqani confided in them that he doesn't always agree with his boss, and they think, oh, wow, we can really work with him. But that misses the point that there's only one person in the Taliban who makes decisions. and that's their supreme leader. And so it doesn't matter what any other member of the Taliban so-called leadership thinks or says or promises to you or whatever. And I think that after they decided that they would not reopen the schools, I think it did sort of sour in an important way their relationship with the international community. And so they thought, well, let's stop trying to make friends. Let's do whatever we're going to do. Let's not sort of hold ourselves back from this vision that we have for what we think is a perfect society, which of course is unlike any other Muslim majority country on the planet. And let's just go straight ahead, and the world's going to have to live with us. And so what we've been seeing since then is, how is the world going to live with them? And is there actually a sort of organized, coordinated effort to push back, or is it, all sort of chaotic and fragmented? And it's certainly been much more the latter, much more chaotic and fragmented. And then in the last sort of 9 months or so, we've seen this process where the Security Council, was obviously sort of flailing and trying to figure out new ideas and a new approach, and requested the Secretary General to provide this kind of assessment of what should be done, what should the international strategy be. We saw that report that came out. It was due by November 17th. It was prepared by a man who's the former foreign ministry of former foreign minister of Turkey. That report it's a bit confusing in a lot of ways. Like, it has some good language about how the Taliban have to comply with their obligations under international law. It has some good language about how Afghan women have to play a central role in whatever's going to happen with regard to the country. But at the same time, what it is a roadmap toward recognition of the Taliban. And Afghan women are saying, like, how can we even be talking about recognition when actually, like, the crackdown on women is getting worse every day. It's not that, like, there was this terrible crackdown and now everyone's living with it. The crackdown is actually continuing to deepen. There's all kinds of things we haven't even talked about being banned from parks and gyms and Banda Amir Lake, one of the most beautiful lakes in the world. Like, I mean, some of this just feels sort of intentionally cruel. But also, we see, so there's both new policies that come out cracking down on women, and then there's increased and new types of enforcement of existing decrees. So, for example, just in the last week or two, we've seen in a bunch of different locations around the country, the Taliban actually arresting and detaining not just women, but also girls on accusations of what they say is bad hijab, of women and girls not complying with whatever the Taliban say the dress code for women is. And that is a new and alarming development. As you say, we've documented the detention and mistreatment and torture of women before, but those women were women's rights protesters. We've also documented women and girls being harassed on the street by Taliban members over their clothing, but we have not in the past seen women being detained and girls being detained over issues about dress code. And so this is one of, unfortunately, a huge list of signs that things are continuing to slide downhill.
Sure. And I think what was interesting to me about those hijab arrests is that when the Taliban put out their dress directives, they said, the first time they just said, oh, we won't do anything to you. And then they actually laid it out. Here's what will happen if you disobey our dress directives. And it was, your mahram will be prosecuted or brought to the Taliban office or whatever the case may be. It was never that women would be the targets of those arrests, or that the Taliban would put their hands on a woman's body, which was something I talked to Fauzia Kufi about this. And she said, that's not our culture, that a man would put his hands on a woman. And you can see in the videos of the Taliban putting those women into the photos, putting them into the trucks. They're touching these women. And it just seems like I just keep thinking they can't do any worse. They can't do any worse. And I keep being completely disappointed. And I wondered, obviously, I don't want to give the Taliban any ideas about things that they could take away further from women, but what would they be able to still take away that we haven't yet seen?
Well, I mean, there's only one major difference between how the Taliban are governing with regard to women and girls now and how they governed from 1996 to 2001 when they were last in power. And that difference is that from 1996 to 2001, no education was permitted for girls. And now girls are permitted to study up until sixth grade, although there have been some reports of even that being infringed in some parts of the country at different times. So that's a major thing they could take away. There's participation by women in the private sector, except for, of course, the beauty salons, and there have been some other areas where they've fired women from particular factories or things like that. But there are still in general, women are able to work in the private sector, and that's something I think everyone's very afraid of losing. There are some exceptions that the Taliban have made to their ban on women working for NGOs in the UN. Those have been in the areas of healthcare and education. And so that's very fragile feeling as well. I wanted to say something about that decree that you mentioned, which said that if women were not dressed properly, they would punish not the women, but the male family member, the mahram. Mm-hmm. I mean, that's an incredibly pernicious thing to do, isn't it? Because it essentially appoints every man, every father, every brother, sometimes every son, as the jailer of the women in his own family. It forces men to be intolerant and be sort of endorsers and implementers of the Taliban's kind of vision of total subjugation of women. And that's so destructive and harmful, not only to the sort of freedoms, rights of women, but also to the relationships within families. And it comes at a moment, of course, where women and girls, they didn't just lose their education and their employment. They also lost their social networks, their friendships, their financial independence, their ability to contribute financially and sometimes contribute as the breadwinner in their family. All of this is lost. And so that also changes the status that women and girls have in their own families. And so the Taliban seem to be kind of intentionally driving this kind of replication of their kind of deeply abusive gender society into the family level as well, and that's been so. I mean, we're hearing a lot about the mental health consequences of all of this for women and girls, including some really distressing reports about increased rates of suicide. And these issues within families have to be helping to drive that,
Absolutely. And I mean, suicide was an issue before for women who were stuck at home, and you would hear the stories about using cooking oil to douse yourself and self-immolation and things of that nature. But I've seen reporting that the Taliban are suppressing numbers of suicides among women, and all of these, it's very distressing to me. And like you said about the status of Afghan women in their own families, Fauzia said the same thing. She said, now it used to be that an Afghan man would stand up for the women in his life. And now there's this atmosphere of fear that makes even that not happening. And you're right, it becomes a jail in your own home. And how terrifying and sad is that? I talk to Afghan women now, and it's always the same thing. There's one woman who's always sending me messages, and I know she is beyond depressed. And it is always, I have no hope here. I can't leave my home. It just hurts my heart. Or a woman I know who was one of the few women who was granted that, it wasn't quite a divorce, but the prosecutor said your marriage basically is null and void because her husband abused her since they were married at, I believe she was 13. And at the time of the withdrawal, he said that he was going to take their oldest daughter and marry her off to the Taliban. And she fled. She was trying to flee anywhere she could go. And she ended up in Pakistan, and she's just terrified, waiting for him. He knows that she's in Pakistan, and she's just waiting for the minute that her daughter will have the same fate that she had, where she was in this horrible marriage that she hated and where she wasn't able to work or do anything. And now she's a hairdresser who does beautiful work and can't work. And it's Anyway, I digress. But these are real people that the Taliban are keeping from reaching their potential, who they're just depriving all of their. They have so much potential. It kills me, but that's what I keep coming back to. Is it's so depressing to me as a Westerner with all of this freedom in front of me. And I want to get back on track. I wanted to ask you about how you're getting this great data at Human Rights Watch, because the other thing the Taliban has done is crack down on media access. You can't, the freedom of the media does not exist in Afghanistan, which makes it, and obviously you can't get into the country to go take these reports and get unbiased information from the Taliban. So how are you able to ascertain what's going on for women in places like prisons and collect data to understand what really is going on behind that curtain that the Taliban put up?
It's not easy. Of course it's interesting because during the COVID-19 pandemic, I think we were forced to sort of have a crash course in remote research. And some of those lessons have proved to be helpful with situations like Afghanistan. But I want to say also that we depend a lot on Afghan media outlets. And I think that they really deserve a ton of credit for the way in which they have managed to keep their work going in spite of the Taliban's very clear attack on media freedom. I'll mention in particular Rukshana and Zan, which are two Afghan media outlets that specifically cover issues related to women. Obviously, they're operating primarily from outside the country, but have amazing contacts and networks, and I'm sure some very, very hard discussions about security and hard decisions that they have to make about how they keep the people who are sharing information with them safe in an environment where the Taliban are very clearly trying to track down and target anyone who's speaking out against them.
Absolutely. So what kinds of abuses and things have you been able to track then through those media outlets that are still operating with Human Rights Watch?
So our most recent report is a report that my colleague, I have an Afghan colleague who works with me. Her name is Sahar Fetrat, and she published a report in December about, it might seem surprising for the Women's Rights Division to publish this report, but it's about boys' education, because as she likes to point out, that is also a feminist issue. For sure, because what boys learn at school has a huge impact on the lives of women and girls. Her findings are really alarming. She found that really frightening increases in the use of corporal punishment, changes, really worrying changes in the curriculum in a lot of schools, with secular subjects being removed, always being replaced with more and more religious studies, a real shortage of teachers, because the vast majority of secondary school teachers in boys' schools were women, and they were all dismissed from their jobs. And so the Taliban sometimes has replaced them with teachers who are not qualified. So you might have somebody who used to teach second grade who's now teaching high school physics or something. The boys obviously can tell the difference. And in some cases, they weren't replaced at all. And so boys are sitting in a classroom with no teacher, trying to teach themselves from their textbooks. And you won't be surprised to hear that in that circumstance, a lot of boys quit coming to school. They think, look, like the plans that I had for, passing the Concours exam, moving on to university, that they're not going to happen because I can't get a proper education at school anymore. And so, I'll quit and I'll go to work. I'll quit and I'll try to get to Iran so I can send money home to my family by working there, et cetera. So we talk a lot about how, Afghanistan has become sort of the graveyard. I think this is something Shahrazad Akbar said. Afghanistan has become the graveyard of the hopes and dreams and futures of Afghan girls and women. But unfortunately, I think that that's also true for quite a few boys.
Sure. And I think about all of the attention that has been given in this country, rightly so, to, education loss that we experienced during the COVID pandemic, which was, 2 years of of distance learning in some cases, but never not learning at all. You know, it was just an amended approach to learning. And I can't imagine what it then is like, because from my understanding, in Afghanistan, many kids didn't go to school during the pandemic as well. Like in-person classes were not allowed, and there wasn't distance learning in, you know, a remote village in Helmand. So you've got this long-term loss of education and hope for the future, like you're saying. And it does just, I reckon back to when Jason Houck talked about going in 2002 and trying to rebuild Afghan society. And it was at, I think he said -50. It wasn't at 0, it was below. And that's where the Taliban are taking society, is way back down below where we worked so hard. I want to talk about some of the things you did talk about this in Rose's episode, but I'd love you to address it now. There's work being done at the international level now to prove that the Taliban are committing gender apartheid and crimes. I believe it's crimes against humanity in Afghanistan. I might have that term wrong, but I'd love for you to talk about some of those efforts to prove those things, and maybe then be able to, you know, have a case to, I don't really know how that helps, but I'd love to hear more about it, because I know that you are very well read on those subjects.
So, yeah, so I think a lot of Afghan women's rights defenders, you know, they feel like they've spent 2.5 years now trying at the kind of diplomatic level, trying at the level of like the Human Rights Council, the Security Council, you know, talking to diplomats in capitals, talking to ambassadors, saying, you know, look, you need to do more, you need to stand up for us, you need to push back against the Taliban. And, you know, and what they've gotten for that is a situation where things keep getting worse. And so I think that an increasing number of them are kind of focusing their efforts and their hopes more on a couple of different legal strategies. So there are 3 legal strategies really that people are working on, and I'll talk about each of them. The first one, as you mentioned, is the idea of gender apartheid. Gender apartheid is a term that Afghan women have been using to describe the way that the Taliban treat women for a long time, since definitely the period from 1996 to 2001, when the Taliban were previously in power. But the complication, so you know, this term has been used a lot since the takeover in August 2021. But people started asking the question of like, does this actually mean something? Is this a legal concept, or is this just like a phrase that we use that you know seems accurate to a lot of people? And that the answer to that is a little bit complicated. And there's a really fantastic expert named Karima Banoun who's talked a lot about this and has written a really important law review article about this. But to try and simplify it, the answer to the question is that international law at the moment doesn't specifically mention gender apartheid. Professor Banoun believes that judges could read it into existing law, but it's not written down on the page. But Afghan activists are seeing an opportunity to try to get it written down on the page in international law. And that opportunity is through a process that's going on right now, where the United Nations is considering adopting a new treaty, which is on crimes against humanity, as you mentioned. In that treaty, in the draft as it currently exists, there's a prohibition on apartheid and there's a definition of apartheid. And what the activists are asking is that that definition of apartheid be amended to say that apartheid can be committed not only on racial grounds, but also on the grounds of gender. So, you know, these processes of trying to adopt a new UN treaty are long and complicated and very, very political, of course. But something interesting that's happened in the last week or so is that countries have had the opportunity to submit comments, written comments on the current draft of the treaty. And so 30 of those countries submitted comments by December, and out of those 30 sets of comments, 6 of them specifically mention gender apartheid. So I think that that's a sign that this campaign is really getting some significant traction. And the next thing that will happen in that process is another meeting at the UN to discuss the treaty that will happen in April of this year. So that's coming up pretty soon, and there's a lot of work that Afghan activists are doing around that. The second legal strategy that I want to mention is, of course, looking to the International Criminal Court for prosecutions. And the International Criminal Court has been looking into the situation in Afghanistan since 2006. And so a lot of people lost hope a long time ago that anything would ever happen. And it's been especially painful to see that the International Criminal Court has been much more responsive on issues related to Ukraine, issues related to Israel. And Afghanistan feels very forgotten, but people are still holding out hope. People are still, making submissions to the court, arguing to them about why they need to prioritize Afghanistan and move forward. And one of the ways that they could move forward is by bringing charges for a crime that's called gender persecution. And that also seems like a pretty good fit for some of the Taliban's actions. The third thing I'll mention, which is particularly timely at the moment, is that there's been an effort to look at bringing a case against the Taliban, against Afghanistan, in a different international court, which is called the International Court of Justice. And you might have been hearing about the International Court of Justice lately because that's where South Africa has brought a case against Israel. And so there's been this sort of wave of attention to that particular court at the moment. It's one of the things that happens in that court is that one country can bring a lawsuit against another country, bring up not a lawsuit, a case. Anyway, one of the types of cases that they could bring is a case against another country saying that that country is violating the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, which is a convention that Afghanistan ratified in 2003 and which the Taliban are bound by, whether they want to be or not. And so there's been a kind of a search for a country or countries that might be willing to bring that type of a case against Afghanistan in the same way that South Africa has brought this case against Israel. And that is an ongoing effort. There isn't a country that has stepped forward publicly to say that they'll do that. But I wonder if the recent attention, because of the Israel-South Africa case, may sort of, prompt people to think more actively about that.
Sure. I can't think of many countries that have not been impacted by the withdrawal in a serious way in terms of refugees and things of that nature. And so I would hope that a country that has been impacted could do that. And
I mean, one of the things that's powerful, though, about the International Court of Justice is that it doesn't have to be a country that's been impacted. It could be any country in the world, It could be
just some country that wants to do good.
Exactly.
Not just a country that's saying, "Oh my gosh, I'm overwhelmed with."
Yeah. It could be a country on the other side of the world that's never had anything to do with Afghanistan, but that feels like what's happening is unacceptable, and they want to be in solidarity with Afghan women. So just takes one country.
I would love that. That does seem like it would not be a difficult thing to do, and could actually have a great outcome. I wanted to talk about the impact that this has on everyone. I have so many friends and family who, I think they might think I'm a little nutty for still, talking about Afghanistan ad nauseum, but it impacts all of us in subtle ways. And I wanted to ask you, because you alluded to this in the episode with Ro, there is an impact that Afghanistan has on the Western world, and that these restrictions on women have on the Western world. And I'll say that I've seen it online. I've seen a lot of misogyny from Taliban supporters or sympathizers affecting Western women who are attempting to stand up for Afghan women. But I'm sure that there are other ways in which that misogynistic and just horrifying worldview leaks out and affects the rest of us. So could you talk a bit about what those impacts are?
Yeah, I'm part of a team at Human Rights Watch. We're about 15 people working on women's rights all over the world. And, I think it's sort of broadly understood by women's rights activists everywhere that we're in the middle of a global backlash. That there's still progress on women's rights in some countries. We still see good things happening, but there's a big pushback happening. That's happening at the national level. It's happening sometimes at the local level. It's happening at the level of the United Nations. And it's really, really harmful. And we're seeing some of the things that we fought very hard for and that were, felt like great and important achievements being taken away again. And so we're really having a very clear understanding at the moment that the trajectory of women's rights is not always forward. And in that context, I think that the situation in Afghanistan and the kind of poor and limp response by the international community to that situation is both driving that backlash in some ways and also is a symptom of that backlash. I think that we're really seeing how little political capital countries are prepared to expend on women's rights. We have to be aware of the fact that the vast majority of political leaders are still men. I think we see quite a bit of lip service paid to women's rights, but never really very much actual kind of prioritizing of women's rights when it comes time to bilateral relations and horse trading and the kinds of things that happen, of course, in foreign policy all the time. And I think that has enormous implications for women's rights globally. I think that there are many groups in other parts of the world, and there are governments as well who, have views on gender that might not be completely different to those of the Taliban. And they're watching the situation and they're feeling like, wow, we can do whatever we want, the bar for what, what could be done in terms of oppressing women and girls got so much lower on August 15th, 2021. And that can't not affect every woman in the world, including you and me and everyone,
Oh, absolutely. It's devastating. And I've started rethinking this situation in my head as you were talking is, women in this country have seen their rights get stripped away in the last few years. And I remember the 90s, just watching these really strong women in the spotlight coming forward and saying, these situations matter, right? And I just expected that there would be women doing that here, celebrity type women. I know Jennifer Lawrence did work with a great Afghan filmmaker to create a film about Afghan women, but that's pretty much the only thing I've seen as a big campaign. But now I'm thinking, oh, well, we're dealing with this other large issue of women's rights. And so maybe you start to just, you can't focus on all the things at the same time, but I do wish that there would be some great campaign that would be a groundswell of support for doing something more in terms of supporting Afghan women and finding, and yet at the same time, I will say too, every time I talk to somebody who has a platform, they're like, oh yeah, I have a small girls' school that I run in secret in Afghanistan. And I'm so heartened by that. So there are great small efforts, and there is, I think, hope. There's one other thing I wanted to talk about, and that is that hopeless feeling. All these women, we've talked about the situations that they're in, the things that they've lost, the difficulties that they're experiencing because of the Taliban. And I really think that it would benefit them to hear that they won't be eternally relegated to the darkness in their homeland that they're subjected to now. And I'm hoping that you might have some insights that would bring them a kernel of hope about, what is to come and what they can expect in terms of the longevity of the Taliban, or the possibility that they once again might have the rights to move freely, dress as they want, educate themselves, get access to public services and healthcare, etc. So what would you say to bring hope to Afghan women right now?
They don't need me to bring them hope. But I would say that, we should all be, there are so many Afghan activists and Afghan women that we should be inspired by, but I'm particularly inspired by the protesters, because, as you pointed out, we've actually documented some of the abuses they've faced. So we understand really well what risks they face when they go out on the street and protest against the Taliban. And the fact that they're still doing that, they're still going out and protesting, I think it just really signals the fact that women are never going to give up demanding their rights. They are never going to say, well, that's what the Taliban said, so I guess I have to live with it. They're never going to put up with this situation. And the Taliban will lose in the end because, these are women's rights. We all have a right to be equal, and nothing is ever going to change that. And so the Taliban are a temporary, devastating dystopia, but they will pass. And all of the damage that they've done to women, to the entire society, that will be a very, very long and perhaps permanent project to try to repair that. But people will rebuild Afghanistan, and it will be a more rights respecting society. And I also feel really inspired by young Afghan women, which, is often the same group as the protesters. There's this younger generation of Afghans, and they have a vision for what kind of country they want to live in. And they're going to make that happen. This is just a very big obstacle in their way, but they will overcome it.
I absolutely agree. These are women who have fought so hard. I often think, that maybe the world still sees Afghan women in their head as women clad in a giant light blue burqa, because that's what we saw from the 90s when, women were forced to be that way. But none of the Afghan women I talk with are that way. They all fought so hard to be educated. They fought so hard to be employed, to be able to, you mentioned this in Rose's episode, live on their own in an apartment in Kabul. All of these things that I take for granted, that they fought so hard for, and they have more fire inside of them. The Taliban have picked a bad enemy. That's what I would say, is that Afghan women really do have so much motivation to do amazing things. And so I am also very hopeful, but it is very frustrating to see the lack of, any real, to see Tom West visit the Taliban and barely talk about women's rights, or to see foreign policy experts post in Foreign Policy magazine and not mention, to say, let's start thinking about recognizing the Taliban, but we shouldn't talk to them about women's rights because that might upset them. Like, excuse me while I choke on my coffee. Anyway, I digress again. I think that's great. I think Afghan women will have their chance to 100% do all the things that they right now are not able to do. And I'm glad that you are fighting for keeping everything that is going on right now in the forefront of people's attention, and with boys too, boys' schools, all of these things, they all add up to a very destabilizing situation that is going to take a long time to rectify. We always close out our episode, if we have one, with a story from someone from Afghanistan, because we want, it's one thing for you and I to sit here and talk about the struggles of Afghans, but we really want to have an authentic Afghan voice on every episode. And today we do actually have a letter. It is from an Afghan woman whom we're calling Latifa, and she's talking about she and her husband, Fazal, also a pseudonym, escaping tragedy by fleeing to Pakistan. And they were among very few people who were able to get humanitarian parole. And now they are trying to make that work. So I'm going to read this story in Latifa's own words, and I do have an update at the end, which is hopeful. I am Latifa from Afghanistan, a member of the civil society. My husband Fazal, a former officer of the border police and the head of the K-9 team, was on duty in Bandar Haratan, the border of Afghanistan and Uzbekistan. After the fall of the Afghan government at the hands of the barbaric and terrorist group of the Taliban, everything collapsed at once. On the day of the fall of Bandar, my husband could not leave his duty and ran away because of his dog. So he was arrested. He was humiliated for working with a training dog. And when the wild Taliban group found out that he was a Hazara and a Shiite, he was beaten and tortured. Even the wild gang killed his dog, and my husband barely escaped from the room where he was imprisoned. He came home after 3 days, and it was early on for the ban on girls' education. My activity continued until one day when we went to the streets for a demonstration, and the wild group of Taliban dispersed the women by using tear gas and beating them, and I was also seriously injured. On the same day, my cell phone was taken from me by a group of savages. I fainted, and when I regained consciousness, I was in the hospital. After 3 days of treatment in the hospital, I was discharged and went home. My mobile phone was missing. There was no news from my friends. A few days later, I was detected by the wild Taliban group and they attacked our house at night. And my family and I loudly informed the neighbors, who luckily prevented them from entering the house. And I managed to escape with my husband and 2 children. And we reached the border of Pakistan at night and smuggled ourselves into the country. We have been in Pakistan for 2 years and we are living the worst days of our lives. Every day is a year. In October of 2022, we were included in the U.S. humanitarian parole system. 4 days ago, we received a letter from USCIS asking for passports and certificates, but unfortunately, we could not prepare those documents. Please, for the sake of humanity, help us. And I will say that this is another of many instances where someone from Afghanistan who is unable to work currently as a refugee in Pakistan, legal or not, you are not able to work, needs funds to be able to complete something that we are offering as a service, and yet they need these funds that cannot magically be appeared. And the hopeful part I'll add about that is that someone did donate to Latifa and Fazal, and now they do have all of the necessary passports and papers, and hopefully will find safety in the U.S. soon. So for any Afghans who are listening, who would like to share their story, we would love to hear it. Anything that you want to say, any way you want to share it, if you want to share a sound file or a video file, you can send that correspondence to our show address, which is the Afghanistan Project Podcast at gmail.com. Heather, I just want to say it's amazing to have you. Your zeal for supporting Afghan women is incredible. And I just think it's made such an incredible impact on everybody who engages with you. So thank you for being here to talk about this really important topic.
Thanks so much for covering it. And thank you for inviting me.
Absolutely. Well, thank you to all of our listeners for sharing your time and supporting the people of Afghanistan. Tasha Kaur, and we hope to see you again soon.